Hello and welcome to the Lore of the Cards podcast, the podcast that uses Hearthstone as a vehicle to unpack the dense and sometimes complex lore of the Warcraft universe. This is episode 2A, Gul'dan, Darkness Incarnate. Last time we finished the story of the decorated paladin hero Uther the Lightbringer. Now we're taking a look at the other side of the coin. Where there are those that serve the light, there are also those that serve the shadow, and none have served it more eagerly or emphatically than the Hearthstone Warlock hero, Gul'dan. In our trip to the bestiary at the end of this episode, we'll also take a look at constructs of fellfire and stone. Unlike many of the key races of the Warcraft universe, such as humans, elves, dwarves, gnomes, trolls and Tauren, orcs are not native to the world of Azeroth. The orcs were a race born to the savage world of Draenor. A little over 800 years ago, Orc society developed a clan structure. The largest of these clans would be the Blackrock, the Laughing Skull, the Lightning's Blade and the Dragonmaw clans. Many of these clans survive to this day. Over time, other clans would also form, some big and some small. Some would endure, others would not. Gul'dan would be born into one of the smaller clans, which had only a small village in the region of Gul'dan to their name. Gul'dan was born weak and deformed, which made him the target of abuse and mockery throughout the entirety of his early life. Orcs are a somewhat superstitious race, and Gul'dan's clan viewed his deformity as an ill omen. As a result, Gul'dan grew to despise his fellow clansmen. Only the clan's elder shaman ever treated Gul'dan with any kindness. However, though the elderly orc did his best to help Gul'dan find his place among the clan, a combination of the constant bullying and Gul'dan's resentment towards his own people made this an impossible task. In the year 10 BFD, this taunting came to a head. Members of the clan beat Gul'dan to within an inch of his life. At the last moment, the elder shaman stepped in, stopping the rain of blows. The shaman told the deformed orc that there was no more he could do for him. He said he'd failed to integrate Gul'dan into their clan, but he also told the young orc he still saw greatness within him. The shaman encouraged Gul'dan to seek out the throne of the elements, and that perhaps there the deformed orc would find his destiny. The throne of the elements is home to the four most powerful elemental spirits of Draenor, the Furies of Wind, Earth, Water and Fire. It was here the orcs of the Shadowmoon clan first learnt the art of shamanism. Fledgling shaman would partake in pilgrimages to the throne, entering trances to attune their minds to the elements and requesting the blessing of Draenor's elements. Despite both the shaman's faith and the old man resting a comforting hand upon Gul'dan's shoulder, Gul'dan slapped the friendly shaman's hand away in anger, rejecting him. This was the last straw for the clan's chieftain. He cast Gul'dan out from the clan. This exile in the wastes of Gorgrond would show Gul'dan what it was truly like to have no people. For months, Gul'dan bitterly wandered the wastes, resentment for his clan spurring him on. He had not needed the shaman to tell him. Gul'dan was already convinced that he was destined for greatness, but he also knew that his deformity would never allow him to achieve his potential within the structure of his clan. However, he was starving and barely able to walk, carrion birds circling overhead, waiting for him to expire. Gul'dan thought the safety and shelter of a clan may be better than endless suffering, no matter how much he may hate them. Gul'dan was at his weakest when, after falling to the ground, the carrion birds watching him landed, a little too eager to gorge. Gul'dan fought them off, but broke his walking cane during the struggle. Now unable to prop himself up as he walked, the elder shaman's words returned to him. Seek out the throne of the elements. In his desperation, Gul'dan heeded those words. Quite how far Gul'dan travelled I cannot say with certainty, but if he was still in the wastes of Gorgrond when his cane broke, he would have moved from this region, across the Tanaan jungle, through the region of Talador, and into the lands of Nagrand. If Gul'dan was not already on the edge of death, this journey to the throne of the elements would have certainly brought him close to expiration. This was Gul'dan's only opportunity for salvation. A pitiable Gul'dan brought himself before the elements, desperate to bring an end to his anguish. The elements took heed of Gul'dan's pleas and reached out to him. However, at the very last moment, the elemental furies withdrew their aid, sensing a darkness within the crippled orc's heart. As the furies backed away, Gul'dan greedily snatched at them in desperation. This forceful act was all the furies needed to confirm their suspicions about Gul'dan. The elemental forces dissipated, abandoning the orc. In the pounding rain, with only a loincloth to cover his body, the defeated, furious orc awaited his death. In the absence of the elements, another voice whispered to Gul'dan in his mind. The voice of the demon lord, Kil'jaeden. Kil'jaeden was a lieutenant of the Burning Legion, a demonic army that sought to purge the entire physical universe in flame. The voice offered an exchange for power beyond the orc's imagination if Gul'dan would become a harbinger of Kil'jaeden's wrath. Gul'dan quickly took to the Demon Lord's teachings faster than Kil'jaeden had originally thought, and with this, the first orcish warlock was born. You see, Kil'jaeden had something specific in mind when he reached out to Gul'dan. This was not an attempt to aimlessly gather more followers for the Legion. During the year 200 BDP, the Draenei settled upon the Orcs' world of Draenor. This group had fled from the rest of their race, the Eredar, after the Eredar had agreed to join Sargeras, the leader of the Burning Legion, in exchange for the gift of power. Two of the three Eredar leaders, Archimonde and Kil'jaeden, accepted Sargeras' gift, but the prophet Velen did not, and fled with those who would join him, renaming themselves the Draenei, meaning exiled ones. Kil'jaeden, who had been very close to Velen, saw the prophet's flight as a very personal betrayal, and the Demon Lord became obsessed with exacting his vengeance upon the Draenei. But whenever Kil'jaeden's forces found the Draenei, they took flight again before Kil'jaeden's vengeance could be sated. On Draenor, Kil'jaeden sought to be more subtle. He needed Gul'dan to unite the Orcish clans to have them finally destroy the Draenei. Before Velen became aware of the Orcs' newfound hostility toward them was the work of the Legion, it would already be too late. With this plan in mind, Kil'jaeden made sure to teach Gul'dan how to conceal his fell powers as well. Now, with a servant, Kil'jaeden needed to devise a way to unite the Orc clans. The Demon Lord also needed the Orcs to be desperate, and their judgment to be clouded by dark emotions, so that their frustrations could be directed toward the Draenei. However, the student became the teacher, as Gul'dan was aware of a time in Orcish history when the clans had been united. Long ago, ogres had sought to dominate the power held within the throne of the elements. The ogres meddling through the elemental spirits into turmoil, affecting the very ecosystem of Draenor. And at that time, to prevent total destruction, the Orcs had banded together to defeat these ogres. Kil'jaeden would have his servant recreate that elemental turmoil. Under his master's guidance, Gul'dan inundated the throne of the elements with fell energies, weakening the world's native spirits. This caused the elemental furies, Gordog, Arboreus, Calandrius, and Incineratus to materialize before Gul'dan. The warlock battered the furies with the power of the fell. Unaccustomed to this foul magic, the Furies buckled before the Warlock and were almost destroyed, fleeing before Gul'dan's wrath. Those who had rejected him previously had now been dominated by him, and Gul'dan found this dynamic intoxicating. Gul'dan's tampering sent the elemental spirits of Draenor into disarray. The usual passing of the seasons became unpredictable. Long periods of drought would be followed by devastating floods even in the most arid regions of the world. Rivers dried, and once tropical climates became blanketed with ice and snow. The Orcish shamans did their best to reach out to the elements to relieve their people of disease, thirst and hunger, but the tormented spirits did not heed the Orcs' request for aid. As these events unfurled, the Orcish clans met for one of their biannual Cho'Gall festivals. These Cho'Gall festivals saw many of the Orc clans gather together so elders and chieftains could discuss matters of importance with those of other clans. Chieftain Ner'zhul of the Shadowmoon clan led the discussions at this Cho'Gall, focusing heavily on the elemental unrest and whether the Orcs could do anything about it. As the Orcs travelled home from this meeting, some began to exhibit strange symptoms, including the chieftain of the Frostwolf clan, Gul'dan. The Redpox disease saw disfiguring red sores form all over its victims' bodies and drained their strength. This disease was a mechanization of Gul'dan, created by his dark magic. To prevent this disease from spreading, Ner'zhul suggested the pox victims both remain in Ner'zhul, the meeting place of the Cho'Gall, as well as isolate themselves from other Orcs. Gul'dan agreed and helped construct a settlement for his fellow pox sufferers, before succumbing to the disease in a matter of weeks. With violence and desperation spreading among the Orc clans, Kil'jaeden sensed the time for their unification was almost at hand. But to unify the Orcs, an inspirational public figure would be needed. Despite Gul'dan's undeniable magical talent, he was no leader. Gul'dan could not inspire those for whom he felt only disdain, but he would need to ally with someone that could. To serve his master absolutely and with no restrictions, Gul'dan needed to purge his past. Now in tattered robes, he returned to the village and brought himself before his old clan's chieftain. Incensed by the disgraced Orc's boldness, the chieftain sneered at Gul'dan. He would never be allowed to rejoin his people. Gul'dan mulled over the chieftain's words and erupted with fury. He had no people. Gul'dan grasped the chieftain's head in his hands, and a sickly green light emanated from inside the chieftain's skull, escaping from his eye sockets, nostrils, and now agape mouth. Fell flame, the destructive magic of the Legion, which feeds on and destroys the souls of the living to harbour more destruction, engulfed and consumed the body of the chieftain. The village was powerless before the might of Gul'dan. None stood before him, and soon the entire village was wrapped in green flame. Among the burning wreckage, Gul'dan found the elderly shaman that had been the only one to show him kindness. The servant of demons sincerely thanked the shaman, for he had now found his destiny. Gul'dan then reduced the shaman to ash and claimed the elder's staff. With that, Gul'dan's past was erased, and no mortal would ever know his true origins. His past eradicated, Gul'dan made his way to the home of the Shadowmoon clan, for their shamans were respected throughout the Horde. Surely within this clan, one shaman could be made to serve as the perfect pawn of the Burning Legion. It was rare for Orc clans to accept outsiders into their fold, but the Shadowmoon clan pitied the deformed warlock as he spun a tale of how his village had been destroyed, obliterated by marauding ogres. The Shadowmoon had no idea of the monumental power Gul'dan now wielded, as the warlock was careful to hide it throughout his search for an elder shaman whom he could deftly manipulate. Gul'dan's baleful eye fell upon the clan's chieftain, Ner'zhul. Ner'zhul was a dedicated and bold leader who, when he had a target, pursued it doggedly until the task was completed. He was perfect for Gul'dan's needs. But there was something else that also made Ner'zhul the perfect candidate. Years ago, the chieftain had been struck by tragedy when his mate, Rolkan, passed away. Previously, Ner'zhul was able to manage his grief by communing with the elements, but with them now in flux, he was unable to fill the hole that had been left by Rol'Khan's passing. Gul'dan was able to fake empathy, pretending he too had felt the sting of loss when his clan had been killed by ogres. Ner'zhul opened up to Gul'dan and came to view the outsider as a friend, even taking him on as his shamanistic apprentice. Now with access to a public figure, Kil'jaeden set about subtly bending Ner'zhul's will to his own, and sent Gul'dan on another mission, to turn the orcs against the Draenei. The warlock focused his attention on the Bladewind clan. This clan's largest village lay on the outskirts of the Teron'gore forest, near the Draenei's capital of Shattrath. For decades, tensions had simmered between the Bladewinds and the Draenei. The orcs would occasionally ransack caravans and enslave the survivors. The Draenei answered these attacks with stronger caravan defences, though they never fought back too hard, as they did not wish to start a war with the orcs. The elemental upheaval had badly affected the Bladewind clan. Their water sources were running dry, the game they hunted was dying off, and the red pox disease had run rampant. Around 70% of the Bladewinds had succumbed to the disease. As Gul'dan had become a representative and shaman of the Shadowmoon clan, his words carried weight, and the Shadowmoon were generally respected by the other orc clans due to their deep shamanistic history. Gul'dan convinced the Bladewinds that the Draenei were to blame for both the red pox and the world's elemental woes. Gul'dan told the Bladewind clan that if they spilt the blood of the Draenei, this would appease the elemental spirits, and order would be restored. The Bladewind heeded Gul'dan's words and, desperate to reverse their fortunes, began to assault Draenei caravans in even greater numbers, spilling the blood of those who were actually innocent. Gul'dan watched from afar as the Draenei's patience reached breaking point. The Draenei finally attacked the Bladewind settlement. Still determined to appease the elements, the Bladewind clan fought to the last, but were nearly all killed in the ensuing battle. Those that escaped the violence were murdered by Gul'dan as they fled. The warlock made sure that only his tale of what happened here would survive. Upon returning to the Shadowmoon clan, Gul'dan gave his version of events. The brutish Draenei had attacked the Bladewinds utterly unprovoked and had slaughtered the clan, men, women and children alike. Word of the Draenei's ruthless aggression would spread throughout all the orc clans. The seeds of distrust and hatred toward the Draenei had been sown. Kil'jaeden had also been busy in Gul'dan's absence, appearing to Ner'zhul in dreams as his late partner Rol'Khan, and telling the shaman that it was the Draenei who were responsible for all the orcs' woes. Ner'zhul was resistant at first. The Draenei had never been an overly violent people. Why would they seek to hurt the orcs so much? But upon hearing Gul'dan's tale of what happened to the Bladewinds, Ner'zhul was convinced. He was now far more receptive to the urgings of Kil'jaeden. The Demon Lord told the shaman that the orcs must make war with the Draenei, but the clans had no hope of doing this as they were. They must unite. The demon was finally able to convince Ner'zhul that only he could save his people. No one else possessed the wisdom necessary. A determined and invigorated Ner'zhul told his clansmen of his intent to unite all the orcish clans, and how the ancestral spirit of his mate had led him to this decision. Orcs deeply believe in the wisdom of their ancestors. The Shadowmoon voiced their support, and none more emphatically than Gul'dan. Ner'zhul sent an urgent summons to the other clans, who would meet under the shadow of Cho'Gall. What the orcs thought was a smooth, white mountain was actually the ship that the Draenei had travelled to Draenor in. It was now a place the orcs could easily commune with the spirits of their ancestors. Knowing this, Kil'jaeden made sure to exert his power over Cho'Gall, making sure no orcs would commune with an actual spirit of their ancestors. Weeks passed and the Orcish chieftains gathered at Cho'Gall. When ready, Ner'zhul addressed the gathered throng. He told all the clans of Rol'Khan's prophetic warning. The Draenei had caused the elemental unrest, given them the red pox, and slaughtered the Blade Winds. And the Draenei would not stop until all Orcs were wiped out. Ner'zhul told the clans there was a way to avert disaster if they united. Knowing most Orc clans were quite solitary, Ner'zhul gave them a day to consider their position, so the true weight of the Orcs' predicament could sink in. The debate over Ner'zhul's proposal raged into the night. Some more war-hungry clans were happy to unify, as they had become wary of the Draenei since the Blade Wind's obliteration. Others were unsure of what to do. The most vocal of these leaders was Chieftain Zagrul of the Whiteclaw clan. He was sceptical that killing the Draenei would improve the Orc situation, and even thought it could anger the elements further. Others also had their doubts, but were not nearly so vocal. The Draenei seemed kindly until now, but their Orcish ancestors would not lie. Several shamans from other clans were also backing Ner'zhul's visions, saying they were visited by their own ancestors and told similar information. However, these were of course not true ancestors, but the mechanizations of Kil'jaeden. As the debate went on, Gul'dan skulked around the gathered clan leaders. He knew other Orcs perceived him as weak due to his physical deformities, and would use their false perception to his advantage. He would occasionally interject, championing Ner'zhul's call to war. This made the clan leaders think twice. If even this crippled Orc was willing to fight and die for his people, why weren't they? Gul'dan made accepting the war a matter of honour. This manipulation swayed many to see the necessity for war, but Zagrul and a few others remained firm in their beliefs. Gul'dan made sure to make note of who they were. But the warlock had done enough. When voting came at dawn, nearly every chieftain agreed to unite and fight the Draenei. From that day forth, the unified Orc clans would be known as the Horde. The clans rallied their warriors and began their battle against the Draenei with sporadic attacks against Draenei hunting parties. The Draenei did their best to communicate with the Orcs, trying to find out why their hostility toward them had escalated, but these calls for communication were either ignored or met with more open hostility. Once the Draenei had established that the Orcs had united, they knew there would be no reasoning with them. War had arrived. However, the Draenei merely reinforced their holdings rather than fight back. They pitied the Orcs. They did not know the Orcs were pawns of the Burning Legion. The Draenei still saw the Orcs as victims of the current elemental unrest, lashing out, confused, scared of what the future may hold. Ner'zhul watched the war with the Draenei unfold, and a sense of trepidation grew within him. Despite listening to the spirit of his beloved, no good was yet to come from the war. The Orcs were developing a taste for shedding the blood of their enemies, but to the shaman's dismay, he could no longer hear the elemental spirits at all. They were utterly silent. Sensing Ner'zhul's doubts, Kil'jaeden returned to his dreams as Rol'Khan. The false image of Rol'Khan told the anxious shaman that she could put him in contact with a powerful ally who could help the Orcs defeat the Draenei and bring balance to the world. Obviously, Ner'zhul accepted this offer from his mate, and the next night, Kil'jaeden appeared to Ner'zhul in the form of a radiant elemental entity. Ner'zhul was in awe of this new elemental benefactor, but as it spoke, his uneasiness returned. Kil'jaeden told the shaman to press the Orcish attack before the Draenei could fully muster their defences, and promised that if this was done, Ner'zhul would please the elements. The shaman picked up that this elemental spirit was all too eager to annihilate the Draenei, showing them no mercy. This new spirit was also obsessed with killing a particular Draenei, Velen. The shaman had never known an elemental to be so violent, and his suspicions were further raised. Since Kil'jaeden's arrival into Ner'zhul's dreams, Rol'kan had gone silent. Ner'zhul needed the guidance of his mate now more than ever. He headed off in secret to Cho'Gall to seek her advice. However, Kil'jaeden was aware of Ner'zhul's plans. The shaman had not turned out to be the leader the Demon Lord had hoped for, and Kil'jaeden turned once again to Gul'dan for assistance. He commanded Gul'dan to gather allies to help him control the Shadowmoon clan, as Ner'zhul could no longer be relied upon. Gul'dan started by meeting with a young, highly respected shaman of the clan, Teron'gore. The frustrated shaman had been trying to commune with the elements for some time now, trying to invoke their aid against the Draenei in the ongoing war. Gul'dan introduced Teron'gore to Fel magic, touting it as a higher form of shamanism. After witnessing the power of Fel magic firsthand, the young orc was convinced that this was the power that would give him the means to help his troubled race, and he willingly accepted Gul'dan's training in the art. Gul'dan did not stop there. He won more shaman to his side and trained them in the wonders of Fel magic too. While these shamans started learning this dark magic with the intention of aiding their people, the influx of Fel energy soon burned these noble intentions away. The corruptive power of Fel energy twisted their thoughts and darkened their hearts. They became loyal to Gul'dan alone. These were the first steps Gul'dan took towards establishing an organisation within the Horde that would guide many of its decisions in the future, the Shadow Council. While Gul'dan trained his new subordinates within the Shadowmoon clan, Ner'zhul had reached Cho'Gall. Ner'zhul's desire to seek guidance from his beloved Rol'kan was so strong his will broke through the invisible barrier Kil'jaeden had placed on the mountain to prevent the orcs from communing with their ancestors. Voices of the dead howled in Ner'zhul's mind, including that of the real Rol'kan, no longer a deception created by Kil'jaeden. Dismayed, she told Ner'zhul that he had been used. She said the Draenei were not the enemy, but that the demon who had sent the orcs against them surely was. Both Kil'jaeden and Gul'dan sought to corrupt the orcs, and the Horde was a creation of their dark desires. Ner'zhul was left stunned. Not only had he been deceived and damned his people, but he had also been played for a fool by his apprentice Gul'dan from the very beginning. Ner'zhul had thought of Gul'dan as his friend and confidant until now. For Ner'zhul's part in this, the orcish ancestors turned their back on him. This crushed the elder shaman, and for a spiritual orc like himself, this was a fate worse than death. However, he could not blame them. He had helped sell out his people. He knew he would never win back the favour of the spirits. A dejected Ner'zhul, his heart heavy and head hung low, set off back towards Shadowmoon Valley. Though he may never be forgiven, Ner'zhul resolved that he would do his best to sabotage the plans of Kil'jaeden and his servant Gul'dan. However, when the elder shaman returned home, he would not get a chance to hatch his plans, as he was immediately apprehended by Gul'dan and his new followers. Gul'dan's newly trained warlocks bayed for Ner'zhul's blood, but Gul'dan made sure to enact the punishment Kil'jaeden had concocted. The Demon Lord wanted Ner'zhul alive so that he could witness the ultimate downfall of his race. He would not be granted the release of death, for Ner'zhul had betrayed Kil'jaeden, an act which the Burning Legion did not take lightly. Leaving Ner'zhul alive but captive would also arouse less suspicion in the other orc clans. For if Ner'zhul, the one who had passionately lobbied for war, were to suddenly disappear, it would certainly seem odd to the others. For months, Ner'zhul was abused by Gul'dan and his lackeys and treated like a slave. Ner'zhul feared these beatings would lead to his demise and became increasingly timid as they went on. Eventually, Ner'zhul all but faded away from the public eye, and Gul'dan and his warlocks became the de facto voice of the Shadowmoon clan. While Gul'dan had been seizing control of the Shadowmoon clan, the Orcs' war on the Draenei continued, rather unsuccessfully. They had crushed smaller outposts, but larger Draenei settlements remained beyond their reach, due to bickering among the clans. The Horde needed a leader, and Gul'dan yearned to take up that mantle. However, Kil'jaeden knew that Gul'dan's strength did not lie in leadership, especially on the scale of leading the entire Horde. Gul'dan's strengths lay in manipulation and subterfuge. As a leader in the public eye, the Warlock would not be able to play to his strengths. Kil'jaeden told Gul'dan to find a new leader before the Horde crumbled. Gul'dan was furious that his master had not selected him, but still obliged the demon. If there was one thing the mighty Warlock feared, it was enraging Kil'jaeden. Gul'dan knew immediately who to select for the role: Chieftain Blackhand of the Blackrock clan. The Blackrock had military discipline and an elemental forge with which to craft weapons, two things that would massively benefit the other clans. Gul'dan travelled to meet with Blackhand and attempted to convince the blusterous leader to become war chief of the Horde. The Warlock appealed to the warrior's pride and promised to make the Blackrock clan the mightiest clan in all of the Horde. Blackhand's shamans would no longer be impotent. They would wield otherworldly power, and the chieftain would be forever remembered as one of the greatest orc leaders to ever live. The Warlock knew Blackhand would require examples of this power before he agreed to lead the Horde, so Gul'dan trained several shamans of the Blackrock clan in fel magic. He also taught these spellcasters how to magically increase the numbers of the Blackrock clan's armies. By flooding adolescent orcs with fel magic, Gul'dan showed the shaman they were able to speed up their development, growing rapidly and increasing their strength, creating more orcs that were of fighting age. The side effect was that the fel energy warped the young orcs' minds, making them susceptible to sudden outbursts of violence. Blackhand did not care about this and was extremely pleased with the results, so much so that he ordered his own sons, Dalrend and Maim, be transformed into proper soldiers with fel energy. Suitably impressed by Gul'dan's talents and seeing him as a valuable ally, Blackhand agreed to lead the Horde. To support his leadership, Gul'dan told Blackhand that he would create a secretive order to help him watch over the Horde and maintain control of the Orcish forces. The Shadow Council was formed, welcoming Blackhand as one of its members. However, unbeknownst to the would-be war chief, Gul'dan was only including him as part of the Shadow Council to give Blackhand the impression that he had control of all aspects of the Horde. But Blackhand was no fool. He did not fully trust Gul'dan. Though the Warlock hoped to make the war chief a puppet ruler, Blackhand sought to use Gul'dan to secure his place in Orcish history. While Blackhand renewed his offence against the Draenei, Gul'dan formed the Shadow Council. The first members were the warlocks he had trained within the Shadowmoon clan. Others were soon introduced from other clans and all swore not to betray the council, as well as keep its existence and purpose a secret. Two of the council's most notable members, besides Gul'dan, Blackhand and Teron'gore, were Garona and Cho'Gall. Garona was a half-orc Draenei and perhaps the only survivor of the massacred Bladewind clan. Garona was a skilled fighter and able to speak the Draenei language, and she stumbled across the Shadow Council during her travels. Gul'dan saw potential in the young half-orc and won her over. He was able to empathise because, as a half-breed, Garona's early life was filled with abuse, much like Gul'dan's. When Garona let her guard down and trusted him, Gul'dan betrayed her. The Shadow Council ensorcelled the young half-orc and put her to work as the Shadow Council's assassin. Cho'Gall was a two-headed ogre who once resided in the ogre city of Highmall. However, the ogre aristocracy felt threatened by his popularity and tried to have him assassinated. Gul'dan was intrigued by the ogre's drive and took him on as his foremost apprentice. Cho'Gall joined the Shadow Council in hopes of gaining more power to enact his vengeance. Around this time, Gul'dan also formed another group of orcs with the help of Kil'jaeden, called the Necrolites. These orcs specialised in the art of necromancy. Their spells were capable of spreading disease and plague through the Draenei ranks, as well as raising the dead to fight alongside the Horde. With the Shadow Council now fully formed, Blackhand could ascend to the rank of War Chief. Gul'dan knew the other headstrong Orcish clans would not yet be willing to accept Blackhand as War Chief of the Horde, so he sent out his agents in the Shadow Council across the clans. The agents dedicated their time to spreading stories of Blackhand's mighty deeds, including how his shamans had discovered a new power, even greater than that of the elements. While they spellbound many orcs with their tales, the Council's agents also spied on the other clans, relaying this information back to Gul'dan. One orc in particular drew the warlock's ire, much as he had during the forming of the Horde at Oshu'gun, Zagrul of the Whiteclaw clan. However, this time Gul'dan could act on Zagrul's insolence. Zagrul was looking to end the orcs' pointless war and return to honouring the elements, so that they would once again heed the calls of the orcish shamans. But Gul'dan sent out Garona, who deftly assassinated the chieftain. Zagrul's death was suspicious given his opposition to the war, but there was no trace as to who had murdered him. With Zagrul dead, Gul'dan led the orcs down a road of corruption that they would not veer from for many years to come. We'll learn about that and the orcs crossing into Azeroth in the next episode. Before we take a trip to the bestiary, I hope you're enjoying this podcast so far. If you are, show it some love. If on YouTube, do the YouTube things. Like, share, comment, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Is it me or is that list becoming a bit stupid? If on iTunes, give it a review if you haven't already, and on Spotify, make sure you follow it. Hopefully soon in this section I'll be able to thank people for their reviews as well as have a look at a few comments and let you know some general podcast news, rather than just making it the obvious call to action. Anyway, let's get back to some lore, shall we? Since we were covering Gul'dan today, I thought it would be fitting to look at one of the demonic pawns of the Burning Legion, the Infernal. These gargantuan constructs can be created by those proficient at wielding fell energies, infusing matter with fell magic. The most common form of Infernal are blackened rocks animated and held together by fell energy, which can be seen in the rock's crevices, binding the separate pieces together and creating two eyes within the rock used for the Infernal's head. The process of infusing the matter to create an Infernal is not a quick one. Firstly, warlocks summon fire elementals into fouled pools of either water or lava, corrupting them and turning them into infernal souls. These souls are then infused into fell rocks by demonic engineers. These fell rocks then become infernals. Seemingly at the centre of an infernal is its infernal power core. If defeated, this core can be infused with fell fire to near instantly resummon an infernal. Dormant cores can also be stored, allowing armies of the constructs to be summoned near instantly as well. The Burning Legion use dormant cores to great effect, which allows them to summon the infernals and have them rain down from the skies as meteors. Infernals exist to crush and pummel whatever stands in their way, like mobile siege weapons. Generally speaking, Infernals are not tacticians, they are sent in a direction and destruction is left in their wake. Even when defeated, the stones of an Infernal's body are so steeped in fell energies they will begin to corrupt the land on which they lay. Abyssals are also similar to Infernals, but usually more powerful and made up of jagged stone. Their flames can be red, green, or even blue. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to talking to you again next time. Bye bye.